again, I'd like to welcome everybody for another of the historicals, Delano Franklin Township Area Historical Society, but the Delano Historical Society. We do an event, we try to do it the first Saturday of every month, and we have done various topics, whether it's some of the old skills that people still use, presentations on different companies and businesses that have been in town or about the buildings in town. We've done various things, but if anybody has any suggestions, we're open to that as well, because we'd like to cover a lot of interesting topics and entice more people into these events. We also would like to entice people to join the Historical Society, so if you know of anybody, we do have forms that are on the table there. Our big project right now is trying to raise money, of course, but to help refurbish the old City Hall, to make it more of a community space for the community, as well as keeping the historical integrity of the building. So that is something that you can look at. We do have the floor plans of what we're planning on doing on the main floor and the upstairs. So that is there as well. I think that's everything. There's cookbooks that we have too. For a donation of $20 or more, you get a free cookbook to the building fund. And do you think anything else, Brad? No. Okay. Quick on the spot. Anyways, it's my privilege to introduce Phil Gilmore. He is going to talk about the Granite Works, the Delano Granite Works, which was definitely a major business in Delano for a number of years, I think almost 70 years. So he's got some great pictures and some wonderful stories about the Granite Works. And I'll leave it to you. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much, Deb. Thank you all for coming. This is really a pleasure to come out here and relive a little history of the Granite Works, which was an important part of the community for so many years. I think it's really remarkable that there's so many people in Delano, both old-timers, long-timers, short-timers, newcomers, that have this interest and a passion for maintaining history of your community and want to share this with other people here. Very disciplined respect for history, I think, is very important, and Delano gets it. I think I'm very impressed with that. Can you hear me okay? Okay. I'm honored today to share some of my knowledge of the history of Delano Granite Works. I'm going to cover roughly 50 years of history up until 1972, when we sold the business to Rembrandt. For those of you who might not know me, I'll share a little bit of my background. My grandfather and my father, my grandfather Bert Gilmer founded the business back in 1917. And my father, Don Gilmer, worked part-time for Bert from 1936 until 1942 when he went into the service. And then he came back in after the war, 1945, and became president of the company in 1955. He continued to grow the company until selling it in 1973. I naturally grew up in the business, working part-time during summers through high school, and then after college I went to work first in the quarries and then came back into the shop and did a little of everything in the plant. One of my first jobs was painting the office out on the highway, and then eventually painting the entire plant in one summer. Quite a job. This plant was over 700 feet long, 122,000 square feet of plant space. So there was a lot of painting I had to do. So I got to see a lot of the business from the bottom and the top of a ladder. I did a lot of jobs in the plant. After coming back, I worked for Rastus Huncha in the layout area and doing labor jobs around the plant. I worked for Deacon Bruin for a summer, working with the setters, with people like Franny Tyson, Vern Zitzloff. I'm trying to think of some of the other fellows. Johnny Wilhelm, I think a lot of you knew him. And then I worked in the office figuring out commissions with Millie Stein, or Millie Lenz, the consummate perfectionist. That was a very interesting time. She demanded perfection just like everybody else, it seemed, in the plant who were craftsmen and artists demanded perfection in everything they did. And when I'm trying to figure out commissions for the salesperson, I'd turn in the paperwork to Millie, and she'd always send it back to me with corrections. I wondered, what am I doing here? Why am I doing this if she's going to correct everything I do? She could do it. But anyway, I learned a lot from her, and one of those things I learned was perfection is all important in this kind of an industry. After college, I came back to the Granite Works and worked full time, doing another number of jobs. I worked in the quarries under Leo Kuklak, teaching me the fine art of running a jackhammer, how to run a hoist, and how to oil an air compressor. Something every young man out of college really should know. I came back to the plant, and then after, when I could sneak out into the plant, I could learn some of the other craft items such as carving stone, polishing, and even doing sandblast lettering. I really wanted to learn some of those details. My grandfather, when he founded the company, he worked in absolutely every aspect of the Granite Works and learned every job that had to be done. I later, toward the end, I became plant superintendent up until about 1972 when we sold the company to Rembrandt. Anyway, a history of Delano Granite Works is really a story about the people and the machines that made the company what it was. It's a story that starts with Bert Gilmer, a young man with vision, grit, and drive, who put together a team of skilled craftsmen, rugged stone cutters, homegrown natural engineers, and built what eventually became the largest retail granite memorial company in the world. Over the course of time, his son Don would build the company into a major architectural granite company using the latest technology for its time. He also developed a highly skilled workforce and a sales organization that was respected nationwide. Eventually, global competition from every corner of the world, a tough economy in the US, and the rapid evolution of foreign technology would take a toll on the Granite Works. We simply could not keep up with the relentless tide of modernization that was required. These same forces would forever change a lot of industries in the United States for the better and for worse, now that we've become a more globally interconnected country. I'm now going to take you back to our beginnings and work our way forward. So let's meet some of the people and the machines that made the Granite Works what it is. Back around 1915, 1916, Bert Gilmer was a budding entrepreneur. He started out selling nursery stock up in Howard Lake. Up in Howard Lake, there was a granite dealer that hired Bert on. Bert wanted to make a little bit more money, so he hired Bert to go out and sell memorials. It was really difficult for Bert to collect commissions on his sales, so he decided there's got to be a better way to make a living. So he comes to Delano and starts his business from scratch. Bert started out doing everything. He worked as a stone cutter, a carver, janitor, salesman, bookkeeper. But anyway, he built up this company. Over the years, he became president of the State Bank of Delano. He was the first president of the Lions Club, and eventually mayor of Delano. Delano Granite located its first factory, first plant, down on Bridge Street. The building is still there. You might recognize this as the old Diddy Plumbing Building, the original Diddy Plumbing Building, we refer to it as. This was just directly west of the existing City Hall. Do all of you recognize the building? Even back then, Bert was incorporating some of the latest technologies into the production of granite. He brought in blocks from all over the country and would saw the blocks in this little plant. He had some fairly heavy equipment that he had to use to actually cut the granite. But he would bring in blocks that weighed roughly 5 to 10 tons and saw these with gang saws inside this plant and polish them and finish the granite off. Bert, in his years, traveled all over the world to learn the latest technologies in granite production. One of his firm beliefs was to be successful, you had to use the best and latest technology that was available in its time. And in this picture, why I show that is he was a pioneer in the incorporation of dust collection in the handling of granite. Granite dust is very toxic, very hazardous material to work around. And so he incorporated dust collectors. You can see in the picture the hoses hanging down to the workspace. And this was to collect dust from the tools that were being used to finish off the granite. The other technology that was becoming used in the granite industry was the use of compressed air for running the equipment. Prior to that, a lot of it was purely belt-driven equipment where a large line shaft would run the length of the plant and belts would be connected from the line shaft down to the tools. Very, very primitive way to operate heavy equipment. And so the incorporation of compressed air now is brought into these tools for handling the granite, chipping the granite away to make smooth surfaces. So what we're looking at here is a surfacing machine, which the man is operating in the center, that uses compressed air to literally hammer the granite smooth using carbide tip tools. What I'm going to try to point out through the presentation and to show you with pictures and commentary is how my grandfather Bert established what he called founder's principles throughout the course of the granite company. It was very important for him to be successful. He would have to keep the cost of production low and keep the product quality very high, and also make his product affordable. The key to success was low cost of production, high quality of product. And to achieve that, he located the plant in Delano for several reasons. One, he lived here, so it made sense to locate it here, but also he needed to locate the plant in a location along a reliable railroad line and highways, but also be in the center of the granite region. At the time, most of the granite was coming out of Wisconsin, South Dakota, and the St. Cloud area in Minnesota. Those used the latest and best mechanical equipment that you could buy. It was very, very important in the granite business to own your own granite quarries. If you controlled the supply of granite, you had control of the prices. If he couldn't quarry his own granite, you buy the granite from other people by the train load. Makes for much more, allows you to keep your costs low. Factory supplies, he would buy those by the carload. In later years, he established a separate company that would buy granite processing supplies such as cutting wheels, diamond saws, silicon carbide, and he would in turn sell that to other granite companies. Bert wasn't necessarily a green environmentalist, but he did believe in using the latest in electricity being generated by hydroelectric power rather than coal-fired power. So the final thing was employ only trained specialists. Grandpa, if he couldn't get a trained specialist that just walked through the door, highly trained in cutting granite, he would train them because Bert did start out doing all these steps himself. So he was able to train his own people. To maintain a high quality product, use only the finest quality granite that you could get your hands on. All the design work for the monuments had to be done by a trained artist, and all cutting and would be done by trained specialists. And again, giving these specialists the best equipment possible. So what I'm going to do is show you how he's incorporated some of these principles throughout the years. One of his first employees, who was a longtime employee of Granite Works, was Clarence Dunn. Clarence started out with the company almost from the very beginning. He was actually a trained artist. He became known over the years as a renowned memorial designer, but he did a lot of jobs in the Granite Works from the very beginning. He started out as a stone cutter. He also served as the bookkeeper of the company, stenographer. But anyway, over the years, Clarence really set the standard for very sensitive design of memorials. He really understood art. He understood what it meant to the families of the people that bought the memorials. Clarence developed what we called the diamond line of memorials, and diamond line to us meant these were the memorials that incorporated fine artistic design, but was also made with the best materials to put out the best quality memorials. His philosophy, as he had written it down, was that a properly selected and executed memorial will express fully the ideals, character, aspirations, and outstanding experiences of the one it is to commemorate. Whoop. Got a technical glitch here. While she's getting me back on track here, I'll mention one thing about Clarence Dunn also. He would meet very often with the families. He would get commissioned to go all over the country, in fact, in some cases, to design a memorial specific to that family. Some examples would be a memorial that we made for a Navy admiral, and the admiral wanted his background in Navy and the war to be commemorated in the memorials. And so part of the design was a battleship carved into the memorial, looking like the battleship is coming out over the waves with not guns blazing, but this beautiful battleship and the big American flag waving. Another was a large mausoleum that we did for Sam Johnson of the S.C. Johnson Wax Company. This Johnson Wax incorporated carnauba wax, which was a wax that came from Egypt, into their waxes. And this mausoleum, which is a large granite structure, miniature building in effect, on the panels of it, he had carved in there camels and palm trees that were the source of the carnauba wax. And this was very important, was a key element of Johnson Wax's product. And this was just a good example of Clarence working with the client to design images into the stone that were reflective of that client's history and ideals.
If you hit this, it goes back to the beginning. So.
Oh, okay. Pilot error. So in every memorial that we built, you could see, or every memorial that came out of the Granite Works really carried a lot of Clarence Dunn's inspiration. It was very important to use the best quality materials in the granite and owning your own quarries. So Bert opened his very first quarry out in Sacred Heart, Minnesota. It was Sacred Heart red granite. Sacred Heart is in the Minnesota River Valley area. But opening a quarry was a very expensive, difficult process. You had to clear off the overburden. In some places, the quarry or the granite was directly exposed to the earth, but many times you had to go through 10 or 20 feet of dirt to be cleared off just to get down to the granite. And then you might have to go through another 10 or 20 feet of granite that was highly weathered until you got down to the good granite. Once you got into what you'd call the good granite, you still had to contend with a lot of other factors, such as cracks and seams in the granite and discolorations, and you would have to work around those. You would usually, in the granite business, you'd throw out almost 90% of the granite just to get a good quality block out of the quarry. That was how difficult it was, and why it was so important to own your own quarries, because you had to be smart, you had to really understand granite, and you had to work around all these factors in order to get that 10% of granite out there that you could use in a high quality stone. In 1927, Burt moved his plant from the Diddy building over to River Street along the river where the Granite Works building is presently located. Burt, before he had done this, he had gone all over the country looking at other granite plants, seeing how they had done things, what mistakes they had made, what was successful, and he incorporated these into his new plant. He built his house next to the plant, which you see over on the right, and then his plant on the left along the river. He built a large craneway with a building on the end where he could store the large granite blocks as they were shipped in, and also display the finished product out under the craneway as well. Over the course of the next 50 years, the building would add on something like 15 additions to the plant, which would eventually become over 700 feet long along the river. His plant, as you can see here, he's got the big granite blocks. Now they're coming in a little larger than they were before. As the business grew and he's selling more monuments, he had to produce more granite. They had to modernize the quarries and develop ways of taking out larger blocks. And so he had to use bigger cranes, bigger equipment all along. And he also built all of his own equipment. Where he could buy equipment, he did. But at this time, there wasn't a lot of companies building granite processing equipment. So one of the people that he had was a fellow named Martin Liebor. Martin was a homegrown engineer that was the chief mechanic that just had incredible skills and ingenuity. And between Burt and Martin, they designed all their own equipment and also incorporated the designs into the building of the plant. You might notice in the plant, or on the plant building itself, there's a door that goes the width of the building, which was essentially a flap door. And this allowed the crane, the overhead crane, to move into the building and come back out through the building simply by lifting the flap door up. And the crane could go into the building, deliver a load of granite, and it could be brought back out and then lowered the flap door back down. Back in its day, it was somewhat of an innovation. Burt wanted to use the latest in technologies not only in the plant, but also in the office. So he was an early adopter of technology, as they like to say today. So he, I don't know if you can notice that behind him is one of the early dictaphones that he used to make that part of the business more efficient. And then the desk you see him sitting at, it's got a granite top on it. The granite is probably Morton granite from Morton, Minnesota. It's called rainbow granite. And Burt provided all of his engineers and managers with desks that had granite tops from different quarries around the country. And people would like that to come in and see the different colors of granite that we had. And he was very proud of that. And to this day, I think there's still granite-topped desks floating around in people's homes. As I said, if you can't buy the equipment on the market, you had to make it yourself. And Burton Martin Libor built some pretty big equipment. One of the first steps in processing the granite was you bring the block in, you had to cut it into slabs. And the early method of cutting granite in the plant were what were called gang saws. Those of you that were around when the Granite Works was running for many years, you heard the loud, loud grinding of the gang saws going 24 hours a day. And what these saws did is they had a big frame that used saw blades that were roughly 10 or 12 feet long and a half-inch thick blade. And as these blades would be dragged back and forth over the block of granite, we would dump chilled shot, or another, it looked like steel BBs, would be poured over the granite slab and down into the groove that was being cut. And it was literally grinding away the granite in order to saw through the block. It was a very noisy process, fairly slow. It would take about 12 hours to go through a 6-foot high block of granite. All that time, the workers out there are contending with a lot of noise, so my grandfather was always concerned about safety and provided the workers with earplugs and earmuffs to deaden the sound. Here we go again. Let's see. Okay. Yep.
Next. I'm gonna just hit this.
Maybe that'd be better. Yeah. What I've done on some of these pictures with the equipment is I put the name of the operator down on the bottom of the page as best I can remember. So I believe in historical accuracy, so I did my best to identify the people in the pictures, but if any of you have any corrections to the historical record, feel free to chime in. But this is Ray Caseheimer, one of 4 Caseheimers that worked for the company over the years, operating one of the latest in polishing technologies at the time. It was called the swing arm polishing machine. Well, anyway, after the granite blocks were cut up in the gang saws, they had a very rough surface on them from being ground down with the granite shot. And so the slabs had to be leveled out and smoothed out before they could be polished. So we had to, first of all, use another finer grade of steel shot to smooth out the rough spots and the grooves that were cut into the granite. And this was done in one of these bins here, one slab at a time. Another innovation at the time was development of a polishing line. This is another Caseheimer, Vince Caseheimer. Vince, incidentally, was with the company almost to the very end of the company, operating the polishing machines. But these are jobs that took an incredible amount of skill and experience. We would put the smoothed out slabs into a bin, level them up, and then use various polishing compounds and grinding compounds to smooth the granite and ultimately bring out a very high polish. Now, as I told you, my grandfather believed in buying supplies in large quantities, but also in establishing relationships with his suppliers. And one interesting thing was he developed a relationship with a wool and felt company where he was able to get all of their scrap felt and wool. It was strips of felt about this wide and this long. And he developed a polishing wheel where they would take these felt scraps and put them together in small bundles and then attach these bundles of felt to a large cast iron grinding wheel. It took a lot of skill to do this, and it was a very time-consuming process, but it created a polishing wheel made of wool and felt, very expensive material, but it would last for a long, long time, and it would hold the polishing compound in the felt. And these would then be put into a big wheel about 4 feet in diameter and would be attached to this spinning polishing machine. And the skill came in on the part of the operator in that he had to continually apply the abrasives, proper polishing compounds, and water, and also move this wheel over the granite and do it very carefully so he didn't create too much heat. If you created too much heat when you're polishing granite, it could cause the granite to break down and pop out. So it took a lot of skill and experience to know how fast to move the polishing machines and how much material to apply to the granite.
What was the compound made out of?
I'll go through the 3 steps. The first was using steel shot to grind the stone. Next was a silicon carbide, which was also called, common name was carborundum. Any of you that were in the granite company all those years know the name carborundum. But it was a fairly new, very expensive material in its day. And Grandpa believed in getting nothing but the best materials. And then for the final polishing, they used iron oxide, tin oxide, and cerium oxide. And then finer and finer grades of silicon carbide. So as you move, just like polishing a gemstone, you use finer and finer grades of abrasives to bring out the polish. So Grandpa built his plant to be as state-of-the-art as he could get. He incorporated, in this picture here in the far back right is where he had his gang saw. So his blocks would be brought into one end of the plant, go through the gang saw, the slabs would be taken off, and over to the far left side of the picture, it's hard to see it, but that's where the polishing line began. And then after the slabs are polished, they had to be cut back down to size for the memorials, and those then would be trimmed up using the surfacing machines with the compressed air, and that was on the front right side of the picture. And then after the stones were surfaced and cut to shape, they would be taken over to the left side of the plant where the carvers and the engravers would be putting the designs into the finished product. At the time, other innovations at the time were the overhead cranes. They had to be specially built and reinforced to carry the very heavy loads that we had in the plant, the very heavy pieces of granite. So he had the overhead crane, as you can see in the top of the picture.
They used some kind of, once they were finished, did they use some kind of a clamp to pick them up? Or?
Yes, they had hooks and belts and chains. So the overhead crane usually had a cable and a pulley on the end and chains that would either grab the stone with a hook, two hooks that would grab onto it, or more commonly, if it was a monument, they used big belts that would harness the stone and carry it that way.
Like those blocks on the lower right there, just approximately what they would weigh. Some of those.
Right here?
Yeah.
Well, these weren't the blocks as they came in. These were basically what we would call blanks. After the slabs were sliced up from a block, they were cut into smaller shapes for the blank monument. How much would they weigh? One of those would probably weigh about 400 pounds. Granite weighs 200 pounds per cubic foot. Bert, as I said, he wanted the best and most skilled craftsmen possible that he could employ. And he trained all of his people when he was building up the company. And I think, can you recognize any of the people in the picture? You'll see Clarence Dunn in the picture. Clarence Dunn is in the back, roughly in the middle. Anyone else? Bert is on the far right, standing next to the acetylene bottle. And then not on the very far left, the second from the left, that's W.J. Sylvester, Bill Sylvester. He was one of the first sales managers for the company. But on the far left, the guy with the beady eyes and the kind of the sneaky look and the gloves and the briefcase, I thought he was probably the local banker. But actually, I did a little more research and it turned out he was one of the designers that worked for Clarence Dunn.
Thank you, Phil.
You're welcome, Steve.
Who's that alongside your grandfather on the left as we look?
Yeah, I don't know.
Looks like Hugo Collinger. To me,
Hugo?
yeah. But I don't know.
He,
That's
you know,
that's
he does. He does have a slight resemblance to him.
You remember Hugo?
Yes, I definitely do.
He
Yeah.
was my first foreman.
Yeah. Yeah, a lot of these people were with the granite business their entire lives. But
For many generations.
yes, many fathers, sons, lots of cousins, brothers. Quite amazing. So in this plant, his first modern plant, he went all over the world to see how things were done and would bring back ideas from countries like Italy and see how they did things. And he would incorporate those things into how he did granite. In this picture here, we're depicting not only the blocks on the right side of the picture toward the back is where he'd bring the raw blocks in, and then the finished product would come out and would be out in the front of the plant. So we fabricated everything from the small surface monuments, like you see in the foreground, to the larger upright monuments, but always incorporating the best design and latest technologies into putting out a product of beauty and quality. As the business grew, he had to deliver the finished product to his clients, and so Bert built up a fleet of trucks. This is one of his first trucks. You can see him standing very proudly beside the truck, over just to the right of the truck. As the demand over the years for different colors and styles of granite, different textures of granite evolved, and more granite was required, he had to expand his quarries and incorporate new technologies into granite quarrying. I mentioned that it's very difficult to start up a quarry and almost more difficult to keep the quarry going because of the need to work around cracks and seams. But one of the newer technologies that he incorporated in the granite quarries was the use of what they call the channeling drill. In the picture, if you can see it, it looks like a frame that's angled downward, but attached to that is a pneumatic drill. It's like a jackhammer, but it's a drill. And we called it a channeling drill. And what it did is it would drill granite. It'd take about an hour to go through a 6-foot layer of granite. And you drill a hole 6 feet deep, you'd raise the drill, shift it over about 3 inches, drill another hole. And you would just keep doing that all day, drilling these channels. And then you would come back behind that with another tool and break out the granite between these 6-foot deep channels. That's why they called it a channeling machine. Then, once you did that, you had to drill horizontally under the granite. So we repeat that process, but we didn't drill as many holes. They would load those holes up then with black powder and set it off, and a very controlled explosion would release the granite from the quarry. And that's how we got the blocks that would then be taken out. These blocks in the picture weigh anywhere from 10 to 20 tons by the 1940s.
How physically, okay, so you've got a little explosion, you've got these blocks.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you get them out of there?
Using derricks. In the upper middle part of the picture, you can just see the base of the hoist house. So we had large derricks. Back in the day, they were built of large pine, a single pine timber, the main mast of the derrick. And then another large timber was the lifting arm. And it was all operated with cables and hoists. And you can't see the derrick in this picture, but in other pictures I'll show you. Yeah.
How many people would work in the quarries?
Well, usually a quarry crew would number anywhere from, in our quarries anywhere from 6 to 30 people, depending upon how big the quarry was and how much granite we were taking out at any given time. This particular quarry here was the Odessa quarry out in Odessa, Minnesota. It was a very beautiful granite, very popular. It was used in memorials and construction or architectural granite. But it was if you look at the Diddy plumbing building across the street, that's covered in Odessa granite. It's a wavy patterned granite. It's got an agate character to it. Very, very pretty granite. And there was a huge demand for that. And this quarry at one time probably had 25 or 30 people working in it.
So once you got it out, did you get it to the train, the rail, or how did you?
Yes. Yes. Some of the quarries had rail spurs going right up to the quarry. The Odessa quarry had a rail spur going right up to the edge of the quarry, so the blocks could be loaded directly on the trains and then shipped into Delano.
The Granite Works kept the railroad alive for a long time after the railroad was ready to shut down the Delano people.
Very good point.
So much granite coming in.
Right. Right.
I think that hoist is still up there, sitting there. Is there many up at the depot?
Well, there were several hoists up at the depot. There was the big black hoist that sat there for many years, and then as the granite became larger and larger blocks, when we got into the architectural granite business, the blocks had to be much bigger, weighing up to 50 tons, even more. And so we had to put a bigger crane in up there. And so that crane was there for quite a few years, and I think it's been taken out. As the demand for more colors and more granite evolved, we had to go deeper and deeper in our quarries. And along with deeper quarries, you get deeper problems and deeper in debt at the same time. But among the problems with a deeper quarry, first of all, there's more pressure at the bottom of the quarry. You've got pressure coming up from deep in the earth, pushing up on the granite, just the nature of the earth, as well as the sheer weight of the granite itself pushing down. And what we would find as we got deeper and deeper, granite would literally spontaneously pop out. So it was a very dangerous environment. You could be working down at the bottom of the quarry, and without any warning, a chunk of granite might just fall off of the edge. So our foremen and the workers were constantly on the alert for this, and they would be walking around the granite above where a worker might be working, tapping the granite with steel poles just to break loose any granite that was about to crack loose. Other problems with the deeper quarries were water infiltration. Groundwater would be constantly seeping into the quarries and had to be continually pumped out. Getting into the quarry itself, getting the workers down to the bottom was risky business. We had ladders and stairways going into the quarries, but when you have a lot of equipment to carry down to the bottom, what we did is we used what we call a skip, which was a half of a boiler tank cut in half. And then that would be hooked onto the derrick using hooks and chains. And the workers would get inside the skip with all their equipment, and we would literally lower them over the side down into the quarry hole. And the hoist house is in the upper right corner where the hoist operator would sit, but he would have to rely on the quarry foreman or an assistant to stand on the edge of the quarry and give operating signals to the workers down below and to the hoist operator as to what he had to do to get the either the blocks hooked up to the derrick or the skip lowered down without hurting or dropping somebody.
It was one of the first amusement park rides.
Right. So, as I said, Bert's, one of his philosophies was you own your own quarries wherever possible. So over the years, he probably, along with my father, probably opened up maybe 15 or 20 different quarries all over the country. But some of the major ones that we operated were mostly in the St. Cloud, western Minnesota area, and some over in Wisconsin. We even had a quarry out in California for a particular black granite that was very popular. And for a short time, even in the Colorado mountains, Cotopaxi, for a pink granite that we called Delrado. Delano, Colorado. Where there was a need for a specific color of granite, but we didn't have the quarries for it, Bert would establish relationships with other granite companies. So we had relationships with granite companies down in North Carolina, for instance, to get a very unique pink granite from them. We got granite from Norway, the very famous, well-known blue pearl and emerald pearl granites. And then Vermont, we got the berry gray granite, which is a very light-colored gray. It's very popular out east. It almost looks like marble. It's such a fine-grained, pure-looking granite. Very nice, but much more durable than marble. And then we actually were going to open up a quarry in Uruguay, and that was called Soca Green. Very beautiful green granite. Green was a color that in the later years was becoming very, very popular, not so much for memorials, but in the construction, architectural area. And then Labrador, we brought a lot of granite in from there. Black. Black has always been a very popular granite. But what my grandfather would do is he'd establish these relationships where he would sell Delano granite, such as the charcoal gray from St. Cloud or the mahogany granite from South Dakota. He would sell that to a granite company in North Carolina. In turn, they would sell back granite from their quarries to Delano. So he developed some very good, strong relationships with his competitors in order to be able to get the types and colors of granite that he needed. As the demand for granite got larger and larger, greater and greater, larger blocks had to be quarried. The early blocks you saw in the earlier pictures were 5 to 10 ton blocks. Now we're getting into the 40s and 50s. The blocks are starting to weigh more like 40 and 50 tons. Part of what was driving this too was the getting into the architectural granite field, where you would cut granite veneers to go on the sides of buildings, required larger slabs of granite, so you needed larger blocks to get it from. And so these blocks would be shipped directly from the quarries into Delano to the siding up here. But some of these blocks, such as the ones from South America, how would they get up here? They would ship these by river or ocean-going barge across the Atlantic or across the Caribbean into New Orleans or into the East Coast, where then they would be loaded on the trains and shipped into Delano. Occasionally, from some of the quarries, we would bring them in by truck from some of the quarries up in St. Cloud or in western Minnesota, where there might not have been railroad access. We occasionally used trucks. The granite blocks were then brought into the plant here in Delano, and as the blocks got bigger, we had to build bigger cranes or get bigger cranes to handle these blocks. The original cranes probably had a capacity of 5 tons. Now we needed 50-ton cranes. So this was around the 1940s, and the Second World War was going on at this time, and it was very hard to get steel, and it was very hard to get equipment to operate your plants because everything was going into the war effort. So between Burt and Martin Liebor, they found that they could buy steel, scrap steel, from the scrap market, but they could also buy equipment from plants that were being older plants, manufacturing plants around the country that might have equipment such as electric motors and transmissions. He would get these on the surplus market, bring them back to Delano, and they would build their own equipment. So a lot of the cranes we see might have been in a defense plant somewhere that was being converted after the war into industry, and he would get this leftover equipment and modify it to fit the needs of the granite works. And so this was how Grandpa kept the company going and modernizing it, is by sheer wits and skill in working with just the very, very basics. As the blocks got bigger, we needed bigger saws, but still, we're still in the gang saw era. Loud, dirty job. These large gang saws, you'll probably all remember for many years, you could hear the loud grinding sound of the saws running 24 hours a day at the granite works. And those were, all that racket was coming from the gang saws. After the war, my father came back. He was in the Pacific as a radar technician and armed with a bachelor's degree in business. He came back to work full-time for my grandfather, and he was vice president, and at this time he started building up a young management team of young guys, John Talke, Clarence Dunn, who had been there for a long time yet, as director of the design, and Chuck King, who is his vice president of production. Some of the other young guys would have been Rastus Huncha, probably, working in the plant. Jack Holton was Don Gilmer's brother-in-law. They formed a team, a young group of guys that carried on the business from there. These guys are all long-timers. John, Clarence, and Chuck were all there until through the 1970s, and then even after the sale of the company to Rembrandt, Clarence and Chuck King were still on at the Granite Works. So these are guys that, typical of the Granite Works, people that came there seemed to stay for a very long time, very dedicated to the company. Clarence Dunn, as I mentioned earlier, was a prime mover in the design of memorials. He built some of the most beautiful, beautiful memorials that can be found all over the United States. Clarence had a national reputation. He was very renowned for his design and artistry. A lot of articles had been written about him in the granite trade journals. So in the 1950s, the Granite Works went through a very rapid period of growth. My father, Don Gilmer, he saw a big demand for the architectural granite. After the war years, the country was expanding. Companies were building headquarters buildings and wanted granite facades on the buildings, and so the demand for dimension stone or architectural stone grew. We had to expand the plant. So over the next 40 years from when my grandfather started the business, we went through something like 15 additions to the plant that just kept getting added on, longer and longer all the time. So this picture was taken back in the 1950s, and the plant overall length was about 700 feet long. As the plant grew, you had to add more machinery, you had to modernize the machinery. Always a challenge. In fact, Bert had said that when he built his first plant along the river, he was very concerned that, wow, I'm growing, but it's taking so much money to keep this plant modernized and add new equipment. So he was always concerned about the cost of producing the granite, because he wanted to put out the highest quality product, but it took a lot of money to do that. As I showed you in pictures of the quarries, you could only take about only 10% of the granite coming out of that quarry was good enough to be a memorial. And to build custom machinery to process the granite took a lot of money. So there are a lot of challenges to running the business as it grew. Whoop, here we go again. Yes. Early on, very early stone carving was done by hand and chisels. But Bert, oops, I wanted to show you. If you look at this stone here, this goes back to roughly 1927 to 1930, 35. That stone in the center, you can see the carving on it. Looks like flowers. That was all done by hand. A man with a chisel, the true artisan, had to create this. So it took a lot of time, a lot of skill, very difficult work to do. But you can see the three-dimensional relief aspect to that carving. The lettering, on the other hand, was done by a process called sandblasting. And Bert used the latest in carving technology using sandblast, and using this material called silicon carbide. He went around the country and saw that other companies were using silica sand, just ordinary sand. It was good, but it was used mainly for sandblasting rust off of steel. But for carving granite, you needed something that would stand up to the hard granite and would also do a very smooth cutting job. So he got this material called silicon carbide, and he was among the first granite producers to use this material. Silicon carbide was a artificially manufactured material that was very hard, almost the hardness of diamonds. Less expensive than diamonds, but much more expensive than sand. And so anyway, as the business evolved, he used that for carving the letters into the stone. The relief carving started out being done entirely by hand, but in later years, they started using sandblasting to do the shape carving and the design carving.
What would happen, or did it happen a lot, or when you were chiseling, like the flowers, somebody screwed up, what would you do? You mean when
Well,
that carving granite, that was an oops.
Yeah, that was a serious oops. There were sometimes what you'd have to do is you'd take that stone and put it back under the saw and cut the face off. And instead of being an 8-inch thick stone, it now became a 6-inch thick stone, and start all over again. You didn't want to screw up. Once a person got to the point where he was a stone carver, they really would not screw up. What would screw up a job would be if you ran into a piece of stone that had a seam in it that you didn't see. And you'd be carving a stem of a flower and it would just fall off because there was a seam or a crack in the stone. You couldn't foresee it. Even Michelangelo ran into that problem when he was carving the statue of David. This is something that's just the nature of stone. So as the plant modernized and new equipment was being brought in, we still had to retain the skilled workers to do a lot of the jobs. You couldn't do everything by machines. So in this picture, even though we're modernizing certain parts of the plant. We're still doing things the old-fashioned way. So on the left, we've got our stone carvers that are putting the final trimming on the stone using rough granite tools such as points and chisels to chisel the granite into the final shape. Some of these jobs we just could not replace with any kind of machinery. Among the machines that Martin Liebord designed was an edge grinding machine or a joint grinding machine. The block of granite might have rough edges and had to be smoothed out before it could be polished. So as the pieces of granite became larger and production demands were greater, we had to go with much larger motors, for instance, going from 10 horsepower motors to 30 horsepower. Big change in those days, and eventually to 50 and 75 horse motors. And all custom designed. We developed a special grinding wheel that used silicon carbide segments that were fitted to a wheel that would go back and forth over the stone. And this was a semi-automated process. Frank Bruin in the picture, who's Deacon Bruin's father, I believe, is in the picture shown here. The main job was setting up the block of granite into the machine. Once the block was set, literally push a button and the machine could go back and forth on its own. Fred Schauer here operated a jointing machine for quite a few years, Fred.
5 or 6, yeah.
Right. And required a lot of skill, right? You didn't want to,
You practice.
yeah, it took a little practice.
That wheel coming around, you could chip out the bottom real easy.
Yeah. And you didn't want to put too much pressure on the wheel because you could possibly break the wheel. You could put too much heat into the granite, spall the granite. So you always had to be attentive to the machinery. So there was always a man in the loop, it seemed. Polishing. Art Willems, another gentleman that was with the company for many, many years. Great skill, great craftsman. Operating here with a tool called the high cycle tool, which is a very high speed electric tool. Some of these were pneumatic, but for grinding curved edges. At the time, there weren't machines that could grind and polish round edges on stones and bring out a polish in them. So this again was very much a craftsman job. Ziggy Hlavnia here, putting a pattern on a stone that had to either be cut in a serpentine fashion, as you see following the pattern, either ground into a serpentine pattern with a power grinding machine, or could be chiseled by hand, depending upon what kind of finish the customer wanted. But again, another job that required a skilled craftsman. Today, this job would be done with computer-driven grinding equipment. Yes?
How long would it take from start to finish to produce a monument and give it to the customer? A week or 2-3 days?
Well, if you put the total number of hours into a monument, because they didn't go, they go into one department and into another, and it would take sometimes 2 weeks to 2 months, depending upon the size of the stone. The total number of hours that would go into a stone, I would roughly guess 30 hours. When you consider all the cutting and the polishing and the trimming, the lettering, the design, that's just a wild guess. A lot of labor is involved in this. After the stone has been cut and polished now, design and lettering had to be put on the stone. And this is just an example of a customized stone. As I mentioned, Clarence Dunn would meet with the customers to come up with a design that illustrated the ideals and values of that customer. And he would design the stone, get the approval of the customer, and then the stone would have to be, or the design would have to be transferred to what we call a stencil in the room called the glue room. Anyway, what we would do is we would put glue on the surface of the granite monument and lay a sheet of rubber over the stone. And then someone like Jerry Lanou would take a very, very razor-sharp knife and carve a pattern into the rubber. And he'd pull away sections of the rubber and take that into the sandblasting room, where, as I mentioned, we use silicon carbide to carve the granite. The sandblast would carve away the granite where there wasn't any rubber. And then the stone might come back out and they'd carve some more rubber off the stone. And eventually, we would get to the point where we were going to, the lettering would be done, and as you get into the deeper and deeper carving or the three-dimensional effects, we would go back and carve with a much finer carving tool using the sandblast process. But we had a pretty good-sized department of about 10 people in the actual lettering department doing the transferring of the design from a paper design onto the rubber sheet and then carving the rubber on the stones themselves. It took a very, very steady hand. This was a job that you didn't want to screw up. You wanted to make sure you had all the names spelled right on a stone, because if you didn't, that stone went out into the scrapyard or would have to be recut. I don't know if you can see the names up there, but Larry Stein, Don Hutter, Hemi Yannick. I think a lot of you remember Hemi Yannick, long time employee. Hemi was really a super skilled artisan that, shown in the picture, getting down to the final carving on a stone, where he's doing the three-dimensional carving using the sandblast process. And where you would start out on the stone doing the lettering using a much larger sandblast hose. When you got down into carving flowers with the three-dimensional effect, you'd use almost like a stylus, a very small carving tool with sand, silicon carbide blowing out of this thing at high velocity, literally carving away the granite. And it really took a huge amount of skill and artistry to be able to carve the three-dimensional effects in the granite without destroying it. And this would be an example of the diamond line product, or the diamond line name that Clarence Dunn developed, and the fine carving that was done. You can see the three-dimensional effects that you could achieve using very good materials and lots of skill. As the business was growing nationwide, we needed a fleet of trucks to deliver the product. Franny Tyson here worked in that department for many years, operating the crane to load the trucks, as well as driving the trucks and setting the monuments out in the field. And Bert's company was, as I think I mentioned earlier, was from the entire process, from the quarry to the cemetery, direct from the factory to the end user. And this was the fleet back in roughly 1955. As we got larger and larger, we also had a fleet of larger over-the-road semis that would deliver monuments out to dealers in other parts of the country. And they, in turn, would set the stone. Yes. Right.
Do those have little cranes on them too, or not?
No. We didn't put cranes on the trucks till well into the 60s, and a lot of them never did put cranes on. One summer, I worked for Vern Zitzloff and Deacon Bruin delivering monuments. And the way we'd do that, we'd go out with a truck like this, loaded up with probably 50 monuments on it, big monuments that some would weigh 600 and some pounds, 700 pounds. And what you would do is you'd put a great big plank up next to the side of the truck, and using crowbars and wooden rollers about so big, so wide, we'd have to literally crowbar the stone up onto a roller, roll the stone onto the plank, and then tilt it up and then very carefully lower the plank down and let the stone slide off the side of the truck. Really dangerous work. It was nuts. But that's how we did it in those days.
Bridge plank.
Yeah,
3-inch bridge plank.
3-inch thick.
Yeah.
It had to be, because with a stone that size, you didn't want that plank breaking.
What kind of wood was it? Well, don't make any difference, as long as it's 3 inches. 3 inches.
Yeah. Later, we did equip trucks with hoists on the truck, but a lot of the old-time setters didn't want any part of that. They did it the old-fashioned way. And you didn't see very many skinny little stone setters in those days. These guys are pretty burly fellows.
What kind of distance did those trucks travel? Did they stay local within the state, Minnesota?
They were all over the Midwest. How far did you ever go, Franny?
My state was Kansas.
Yep, right. So we had about 12 different setters working all over the Midwest. Once we got out of the Midwest, usually we would deal with funeral homes, monument distributors, and they in turn would have their own setting crews. So anyway, the setters would take the monument out to the grave site. They would build a foundation for the monument out of cement, and then come back the next day and set the stone and seal the stone onto the cement foundation. So when we got done with it, it was a completely finished product. It was ready for the family to come out and enjoy the monument. The Granite Works back in the 50s expanded into the architectural stone business, as I mentioned. Among the first buildings we did was the General Mills headquarters down in Golden Valley. There was a huge demand for different colors of granite. Companies wanted to differentiate themselves, become more artistic. So this was made from St. Cloud charcoal gray granite in this building. As in the architectural granite area, the federal government, as it was growing as well in the late 50s, early 60s, they began building more and more office buildings. And this was a big part of our business, was the federal office building business. And this was a case where big government was really good for the Granite Works. Larger buildings. Yeah. The reason I show this particular building is it posed some very, very significant production challenges to the Granite Works. Challenges that would cost the company a lot of money, a lot of time. But it's a very large building, took a lot of granite. So one of our concerns was, this is variegated agate granite out of our Odessa quarry in western Minnesota. It's a quarry that had been in operation for 30 years by that time, had gotten down to a depth of about 200 feet. And what we were finding is that, geez, as we're getting deeper and deeper, the pressure on the granite and changes in color was making it very expensive and difficult to get a very high quality granite out of there. So we're very worried about that. We had to expand the quarry in order to make sure that we had enough granite to do some of these buildings. Another big challenge that we had on this particular building was it required the architect got into this, and he required slabs of granite that went all the way from the bottom here in this corner all the way to the top, was probably 25 stories. These slabs had to be 12 feet long by roughly 6 feet wide, but they had to be cut on a curve. So these slabs, you'd picture a picnic table or a ping pong table and bend that table with a big curvature. And it was a very difficult problem. Bob Hafton.
That's, most of them.
Yep.
I think it was 96 pieces.
Ace wire saw.
One a day, I
Yeah.
think was the
Well, that was, yeah.
Ace wire saw operator Bob Hafton here was the man that operated the saw that was able to cut
We had
these slabs.
a contour saw,
Yep.
curve, and yeah, it was lengthy.
Yeah. So we commissioned a company to build a special saw for us that we'd put this huge block of granite, probably 12 foot long by 6 feet by 6 feet.
They were 16.
18?
16.
16, 17,
Okay.
18.
Anyway, a big block of granite, and the saw was like a upside down, sideways mounted coping saw that could cut the granite on this big curve. And you had to have a really good operator, like Bob here, that wouldn't cut the granite too fast, because if you put too much pressure on the saw, pushing down too hard, what would happen is the wire that was actually doing the cutting would get out of its groove and start going off in the direction you didn't want it to go.
Actually, the wire didn't cut, it just pulled the
Carborundum.
through the carburetor.
Yep. So anyway, that was one of many challenges. Quarry capacity, could we produce enough granite to do it? And did we have the machinery to do it? Again, one of those worries that Bert had way back in the day. How are we going to keep the plant producing granite at the rate that we needed to do? As the granite business grew, Don, my father, his dream from the time he was a kid was to be a bus driver. But also, he, to satisfy his hobby needs, but also he had a vision here of being able to take clients, architects, employees on trips around to the different quarries and plants. We had plants in St. Cloud, up in Braham, out in South Dakota, we had quarries. So very frequently, he would take clients on bus trips. Deacon Bruin, who managed the traffic department, would often drive the bus, and sometimes he'd let me drive it. But the bus was a converted Greyhound equipped with basically a mobile office, but it had a galley in it, restroom, chairs, lounge chairs, tables, and it was really a pretty good thing. He also used it on family trips. So when we weren't using it for business, my father would take us on trips around the country, but we didn't always just go out and see, the major tour sites. We would stop at, it seems like, every cemetery in every big city along the way to just check out what the competition's doing and to see some of the fine work that we'd done in the cemeteries. But or if we go through a city, there's a building we did the granite on. I remember many trips, like to Chicago and Baltimore and Washington, where we would pull up next to the building with our bus and get out and look at the granite that we'd put on the building. So he named the bus Ferdinand the Bull, because it was very temperamental. And we had a crack mechanic at the Granite Works named Bob Farniak, who kept Ferdinand from being too temperamental. He kept Ferdinand on the road. As I mentioned, one of our concerns was the granite quarries, did they have the capacity? This quarry pictured here is the Mahogany Granite Quarry out in Millbank, South Dakota, right near the border. But in the bottom of the picture, we see the original Mahogany Quarry. That quarry got to be about 200 feet deep before we started running into very severe cracking and discoloration problems. We'd get down so deep, the granite started having lots of black blotches in it. It was basalt as opposed to granite. And it was getting very difficult and very expensive to deal with that and to deal with the water continually having to be pumped out of the granite and the cracking of the granite at those depths. So we opened up the new north section of the quarry in the upper part of the picture there, and also equipped it with much larger derricks and more derricks, and also started bringing in mobile equipment to take granite blocks out of the quarry. So we didn't have to rely, we were trying to get away from using derricks and all the problems associated with maintaining and operating big derricks. It became more efficient to use mobile equipment such as front-end loaders in the quarry to move granite in and out and move equipment in and out of the quarry. So this Opening up the new quarry enabled us to produce adequate granite well into the future. The mahogany granite is what you see on a lot of buildings around Delano. Very popular, a bluish red and brownish stone. Another quarry that was opened up, a very significant quarry, was the Rockville Quarry, which was more of a gray colored stone. The federal office buildings were moving away from using limestone and marble because those stones would become discolored over the years. Those stones were relatively soft and would deteriorate and didn't take a very high polish. And so the trend in the office building area was moving toward these lighter colored granites as well. And so this was what the Rockville Quarry was about. The derrick, you can see it in the center of the picture. These are now, instead of being the big wood timbers that they would use, all steel. And this was a 200-ton derrick, had 200-ton capacity, so we could take some pretty big blocks out of the quarry for these large, large pieces of granite that had to go on office buildings. Incidentally, what really drove the huge growth of this quarry, after this picture was taken, the quarry expanded dramatically, but the Time Life building in Chicago and the federal office building, federal courthouse in Chicago, used Rockville granite out of this. And then in later years, after the company was sold to Rembrandt, the quarry was sold ultimately to Cold Spring Granite. And if any of you have ever been out to Mount Rushmore in the last 10 years, the big new reception center, visitor center at Mount Rushmore was made out of granite from this quarry. It's called Richmond Beige. But this quarry had, interesting thing about this quarry, in one side of the granite, it was almost a pure white stone. In another section, it tended toward the pink, and then moving on further away, the granite took on more of a beige tan character. So the Rockville area up in Minnesota has a lot of quarries very close in proximity to each other that had many, many different shades of Rockville granite. But you'll see Rockville granite on a lot of buildings. At the airport in Minneapolis, there's a lot of Rockville granite. Again, into the 60s, a big expansion program was instituted, modernization. Put up a nice new Butler plant just for processing large mausoleum stones, but mainly the architectural granite. Using a combination of more modern machinery, but also skilled hand labor for doing some of the fine trimming and more fine work that had to be done. It took a lot of money. One of the processes that we developed a special machine for was called the flame texturing process, seen in the foreground here. Besides having to cut slabs on a curvature, that same job had to have a surface on the granite that was called flame texturing. And how that operated is we used literally a rocket engine on the end of an arm where we'd pump liquid oxygen or gaseous oxygen and fuel oil into a burner head about this wide. And when it would combine, it would throw out a very, very hot, high-intensity flame that had to be moved very carefully over the surface of the granite. And this intense heat would cause the granite to spall and leave a very nice-looking rough surface on it. But it wouldn't be a polished surface. It would be a very kind of a rough, textured surface, which was very, very popular and still is. But that was a machine that was custom designed by our own people in-house. During this time, too, it required huge expansion of the facilities and working with other granite companies as well to help get the production out of there. We were, in the mid-60s, we were running 3 shifts a day, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week on some of these big jobs. So that was a high point in the business. As the blocks got bigger, we needed not only just bigger saws, but saws that were capable of sawing granite down to a thinner width. As buildings got bigger, weight became a factor. And so in order to reduce the weight of the granite hanging on the building, you had to come up with a thinner slab of granite. And it was very difficult back in the old days because it was hard to get a saw that could really cut a very straight line. And then with all the finishing work to polish it and smooth it out, it was very difficult to do thin granite. So we had to make an investment in newer wire saws that were capable of cutting granite into thin slabs, and then also develop the machinery to handle those thin slabs without breaking them. Just another view of the type of saw that became used. This would use a long wire. The wire was about 3/8 of it was a strand of wire, usually 2 wires twisted together that would run about 1 mile in length from the saw out to a big tower out in what we called the back 40. And the wire would come back, and sometimes it would make a trip out, a trip back, a trip out, a trip back to get this long wire. And what the wire would do, the wire would go around the wheels and would be lowered down over the granite. And as the wire traveled across the granite, it carried a slurry of water and silicon carbide and granite dust. And the silicon carbide was what actually did the cutting of the granite. It wasn't the wire. The wire just propelled the silicon carbide through the granite cut. But anyway, that was how we cut granite down into thin slabs. And that process is still used today, but it's been as technology's developed, they've moved more toward using industrial diamonds with special saw blades to cut the granite. The polishing line was also built by Martin Liebor and Bert Gilmer, designed, built at Delano using largely war surplus motors, transmissions, and steel. As I mentioned, it was very difficult to get those raw materials back during the war years. And in the post-war years, a lot of this material came on the market, so they were able to build this high-speed polishing line at the time. When we got rid of the wire saws, we were able to eliminate one step of the polishing process, which was using the steel shot. We were able to get rid of that noisy, very expensive process and just use 3 of these big polishing machines. So what we're looking at here is just a great big frame on wheels with a big motor driving a large 6-foot diameter steel wheel that carries the grinding material across the stone, smooths it out, puts a high polish on it. Some of the equipment that we could go out and buy, though, as we were modernizing, was the use of diamonds in cutting granite. This was what we called the Patch Wagner precision diamond saw. Another Kaysheimer here in the cutting department, using a specially made diamond cutting saw to cut smaller, very precision straight cuts on a slab of granite. This machine was automated, so while it's cutting the stone, Howard could go back and set up another slab pre-positioned to have a bunch of slabs lined up so that he could go from one slab to the other in a semi-automatic fashion. While we were modernizing the architectural granite end of the business, we also had to keep up to date with manufactured monuments. And so one of the pieces of equipment that we put in was called the hydrosplit, or a guillotine, which used high-pressure hydraulics to literally snap a slab of granite into smaller pieces. So in the foreground, you can see this big slab of granite, which is probably 8 inches thick, by 12 feet long and 6 feet wide, laid out. Laying out a slab of granite was a very critical process as well. It had to be laid out so it would make best use of the slab, get the most amount of usable stone out of it, but also be able to take advantage of the character of the stone and the wave. We liked to have the wave of the granite, or the pattern of the granite, go across the stone in a particular direction. And these had to be cut up into smaller pieces so that it would go under this machine, and it was very fast. You put it under the machine, you would lower these carbide steel tipped teeth down onto the stone, push a lever and bang, just like that. In a fraction of a second, it would snap the stone into a smaller piece. And you could hear this through the plant when that granite would break under that high pressure. I think it was something like 200 tons of pressure in order to break that granite. But in the old days, they used to drill holes and then put wedges into the granite, pound the wedges in, and that would break the granite apart. But this replaced all that. Made
Is there grain in a piece of granite you had to be careful? Or
well, absolutely. There was grain to the granite, but mainly it was aesthetic. You really like to have the grain going diagonally instead of just straight across.
not like wood where if you hit it wrong, it would split
Well,
the wrong way?
yeah, that really wasn't too much of a factor as far as cutting the granite. More concern was looking for seams within the grain. Seams of maybe quartz or even a crack in the granite.
You back it up one picture, you can see the grain.
That was Odessa.
That was Odessa.
Yeah,
Yep.
you see the stripes that goes through that, that's the grain.
In a granite quarry, we had what was called rift and roll, and that was one of the things that a granite or a quarry foreman really had to appreciate was the rift and the roll, or the direction of the grain and the direction of the seams. And he had to be able to literally read the granite, so he knew how best and where to drill his holes in order to break a block out of the ground so that you would get the most amount of usable granite. So it was quite a skill that guys like Leo Kukluk had. Leo was the quarry foreman for many, many years and knew how to look at a quarry and just read how to best take the granite out. In spite of all the machinery that was used in cutting and polishing and surfacing the granite, still a lot of handwork had to be done. This is the hand cutting department where men with hammers and chisels and points, point is literally a pointed cutting tool, would cut the rough edges on a stone. As you see on this base of a monument here has a polished top and edge, but then below that you've got a rough cut surface. And you can't just take that slab of granite out of the hydrosplit machine and consider it done. It still had to go through a trimming process that required a lot of skill on the part of a craftsman to chisel that stone into an aesthetically pleasing finished product. Very difficult work. You really had to have strong hands and a sharp eye. Even right up till the closing of the Granite Works, another skilled process was the polishing, using a lot of the same equipment that had been used for 40 years before that. Art Willems again, back in the 60s, polishing the granite. Well, anyway, this was probably the last picture taken of the Granite Works, the aerial shot with some of the additions onto the building. At that time, we had about 200,000 square feet of production space in all of our plants combined in Braham, St. Cloud, and Delano. And the building was so large and easily identifiable that the FAA put what they call a nav aid, or an identification number, on the top of the building with an arrow giving the direction, so pilots could reference where they were by looking down at our plant.
No, the story that I heard, maybe Franny can confirm it, is that this building was so large and so long that if it hadn't been there, the north end of town would have been wiped out in the flood of '65.
Very interesting. Anyway, one of the legacies left by the Granite Works was Bert believed in putting out a high-quality product and a product of true beauty. And I think what really best illustrates this is the Wassey Mausoleum down in Lakewood Cemetery. This was made out of this variegated granite from Odessa, probably one of the most popular granites we ever had. But besides being an all-polished structure, using very, very thick slabs of highly polished granite, the fluted granite columns that you see going all the way around the building. It also incorporated bronze doors, a completely marble interior. The marble was done by a company that we worked with out in Vermont. And then there was also a marble altar inside, plus stained glass windows. And it's still probably one of the most beautiful mausoleums in not only Lakewood Cemetery, but probably in the country. Very beautiful, beautiful structure. If you've ever gone down to Lakewood, it's worthwhile to go in there and just see that. It's in just a very, very beautiful setting, one of the best settings in the whole cemetery. It's on a corner where you can see it from many different directions. So anyway, we sold the Granite Works in 1973 to Rembrandt. Soon after they bought the business, they built new offices. A lot of things that were inexplicable were done with the business. They soon got out of the retail and wholesale monument business, which really was the lifeblood and which really was the basis of the whole business. After they got out of the monument business, they sold because they're really having very difficult financial time, having given up the real moneymaker of the business. They sold out to Zierden Enterprises in an attempt, I guess, to improve efficiency and modernize. They were able to buy one new gang saw from Germany, and but over the years, they sold all the quarries off to our competitors. So things were catching up to the business. As I said, it took a lot of money to support the business and to modernize the business, and decisions were made over the years not to invest in new equipment. And I think probably in later years under Rembrandt and other owners, they spent money in areas that probably weren't the most effective. So as a result, the sales of structural granite declined. They weren't price competitive anymore. Eventually, the company went bankrupt, and they closed the doors.
Where were those two companies from?
Well, they were from the Twin Cities area. The Rembrandt was a nursing homes and promotional programs for sales programs. They weren't granite people. But Cy Zierden, on the other hand, who bought it from Rembrandt, was a granite person. He had come from Cold Spring Granite. And he made a good attempt to revive the business and continue it, but they just couldn't. Technology caught up with them. International pressure from competitors in Italy and Germany, and then later the Far East caught up with the business. They just could not get enough money to modernize the business. But so I would say the legacy of the business was, this was a business that was started in 1917, and by 1944, the business had grown to be the largest retail memorialist, literally in the world. There were a lot of granite companies, a lot of competitors, but they weren't the direct factory to the customer business. This was a company that sold retail directly and also manufactured the whole product. So it was the largest of its kind. These are all good things about the business. They were regarded as a pioneer in developing the most modern machinery in its day to help produce a product at a lower cost, but of maintaining high quality. Anyway, it was for 50 years, it was the most successful business in Delano. I guess one of the interesting I'll tell you a little story too that I always thought was pretty interesting. One of its legacies was that it achieved international reputation. So my father was at a granite convention out in Chicago, and he came across someone that had some granite blocks for sale. So my dad bought these granite blocks, and it was a stone called Sandvik Red. And a couple days later, or weeks later, 4 big granite blocks show up in Delano. And big red granite blocks. And the story is that these granite blocks were from Sweden, Sandvik, Sweden. And the blocks were being shipped back in, this was 1945. And the blocks were being shipped to Nazi Germany during the war. And Hitler was going to take these 4 granite blocks and build victory memorials to the Wehrmacht for all the victories that they were going to have. Well, by the time the granite blocks got to Germany, the Third Reich had fallen. They lost the war. And so an enterprising entrepreneur, maybe he was a supply sergeant in the army. Anyway, they got the hands on the blocks, and these were the blocks that got shipped to Delano. And Delano took these blocks and converted those into war memorials for our veterans. And to this day, there's a bunch of war memorials made out of Hitler's granite located around the country. So I thought that was an interesting story. So any questions?
Say, Phil, what
Yeah.
was, what was the slogan of Delano Granite Works?
Thank you, Steve. Drive carefully, we can wait. Remember the picture of the bus had that written across the front of the bus.
There was a large billboard out just outside town to the east.
Right. All of our, the setters trucks and all of the over-the-road trucks had that slogan painted across the top of the cab. So whenever you'd come up behind a Delano Granite truck, you would always see, drive carefully, we can wait. My dad tried to have that copyrighted, but they wouldn't let him copyright it, unfortunately. But I've never seen that slogan used by anybody else. Another fun story was, I think it was in 1955, the Granite Works made a big profit that year. And my dad and my grandfather wanted to share that profit with everybody. So they, it was a profit of about $30,000, which is a big deal back in its time. So they got the bright idea of, how are we going to give this money out and make a splash out of it? So they went down to the bank in Minneapolis and got 30,000 silver dollars. They brought the silver dollars back to Delano, and Don Hutter, who was a longtime Delano guy, man of tremendous skills and everything. Don Hutter was a granite cutter, a letterer, and a carpenter, excellent carpenter. So Don took this big piece of plywood and cut a hole in the center, and then Bert's stepdaughter, June McKenzie, very pretty lady, was crawled up underneath the board, and poked her head out of the board, and then we piled this 30,000 silver dollars all around her. So we had this picture of June with $30,000. She was literally swimming in silver dollars in this picture. So after we took the picture, I remember doing this, and I think Steve maybe remembered this too. We had to put all these silver dollars in specially made canvas bags. And every employee got a canvas bag full of silver dollars. And these were handed out then on Christmas Eve as a thank you. So I thought that was fun. I've still got some of the silver dollars, and somewhere I know in my house I've got one of the canvas bags too. But
What year did they do that?
I think that was Christmas of 1955.
Didn't they do that for 2 years?
I'm not sure. I think you might be right.
Or 55, right?
Yeah, those are very good years. That was probably when we were at the peak of the granite memorials, and then we started getting into construction granite soon after that, the architectural granite. And Yeah, that would be the right time, 55, 56. I was here earlier this week and talked to Marion Hayes. Joe Hayes was the head of the sawing department, the wire saw department. And she said that she was Maytag's best customer because Joe Hayes, in the saw department, you're always getting wet and dirty, right, Bob?
That's right.
In fact,
Never clean.
you're never clean, you're always wet.
Why was your concept look like he did?
Yeah, yeah, and it was greasy. It was a greasy job too, because there was always, you had to constantly grease the equipment to keep it from rusting and seizing up. So anyway, Joe would come home every night, tell Marion, I gotta have dry clothes, I gotta have clean clothes. So she said she went through about 5 Maytags over a course of 10 or 15 years. So she was Maytag's best customer.
Yeah, that silicon carbide, you just grind everything to, yeah.
Right, as I mentioned, silicon carbide is this very hard material. It's very expensive, but it does a very good job. But it raises hob with your Maytag washing machine.
All the way from the barber, all the way to the grave, I think it stayed with us.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it was pretty harmless otherwise. It really didn't get into the air, and you didn't really breathe it in. The biggest problem in the granite business was silica dust from the granite itself. So that's why we used a lot of water, was to keep the dust levels down. Some people, most people chose not to wear a mask anyway, but we did use dust collectors everywhere we could, and that was something that Bert Gilmer was very adamant about, and a big pioneer was using dust collection systems, big industrial systems, to keep the dust away from the worker. Yes?
Do you have a lot of injuries or anyone badly hurt?
Well, we're very, we'd have injuries. In the quarries, I don't recall ever having a death in the quarries or any serious injuries. We really prided ourselves on that. In the plant, yes, you would have your usual injuries of, missing a chisel with your hammer and breaking a thumb or a finger. It was always a concern, but it kind of goes with the job. But we always kept the record of, and on a big board in the plant, of the number of days without a lost time injury. And our insurance companies, of course, were on us all the time to keep improving safety. And then when OSHA came in, the government came in, they made us tighten up safety as well. So surprisingly enough, there are very few serious injuries in our business. Yes?
Are there many granite factories open here in the United States?
Yes, there are. Not as many. There's been a lot of consolidation. Probably the biggest one is up in Cold Spring, which is Cold Spring Granite, still a family-owned company. There's not as many as there used to be up in the St. Cloud area. I think there's about 3 granite companies left in St. Cloud, where at one time there were probably 10 or 12. A lot of granite companies down in Alberton, Georgia, Barrie, Vermont. But where the real growth of granite companies are in this country is in the dimension stone for making countertops and veneers for buildings. But the countertop business has been very big. Delano had a lot of foresight back in the 50s. We attempted to get into the countertop and coffee tabletop business back then, but it really wasn't successful because the technology wasn't there to put these products out at a very low cost compared to what it is today. Now the technology has gotten to the point where you can produce this stuff at a low cost, but unfortunately the technology resides over in Italy. And so most of the granite that's put on your countertops is fabricated in Italy or Africa or China. Even the granite processing machinery, some of it's made up in St. Cloud, but a lot of it is actually made over in China. And it's very good stuff.
Was there any consideration of the material like quartz or marble or anything like that, or just
No.
granite?
We just did granite. Marble is a whole different animal, and we felt that the trend is really away from marble and limestone. The trend for a long-lasting, quality, durable product was definitely granite. It's a much more durable product, takes a much better polish. So that was our specialty. You know, we're still working on this, developing the Gilmer Golf Club here. We couldn't sell any in the United States, so we thought we'd try the African market here using this very nice leopard skin. And it's got nice balance. So anyway, if there's any people here that would like to open up a franchise for the Gilmer Golf Club, here it is. The beautiful mahogany club face. Well, I want to thank you very much for taking the time to come here and listen to me and asking all the good questions.
Steve, did you get it right?
You got it right. Very good, Phil.
I just want to thank everybody for coming. There's still some goodies here, so help yourself. And I know that Phil has some things to look through over here as well. So take your time and visit.